top of the hour, and we'll get started here. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We are focused on the cultural orientations approach and realizing strategic performance in a VUCA world. Today, I am joined and am happily joined by my two co-presenters, Joerg Schmidt and Karen Walch. Let me just say a quick, have them say a quick hello to us. Joerg, welcome.
Good morning. This is Karen Walch. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks, Karen. I think Joerg might still be on mute. And let's see if we can get him off mute. Joerg, if you're saying hello, we are still unable to hear you. So it looks like you are on mute yourself, so you'll have to take yourself off mute. Okay, so we will see if we can fix that on the back side. And welcome, Joerg. Welcome, Karen. Thanks so much for joining me today to talk about the Cultural Orientations Guide and the Cultural Orientations Approach. We're really happy to be with you today. This is our third presentation of the content in our newest book, and we're excited to share with you some deeper insights into how this relates to the business objectives that you, our clients, are facing on a day-to-day basis. So let's take a quick look at what we're going to do today and how we're going to do it. Our first order of business is some housekeeping items. We hope to reduce background noise, but of course we want to hear our presenters, so we will fix the mute issue here shortly. So in order to really keep the presentation going, we will keep all of you as participants on mute during the webinar. You can type questions in the question box at any time during the presentation, and we'll reserve time at the end for a moderated question and answer session. We are recording today's session, and it will be hosted on our corporate website, and we'll share that link with you after today's session. When we switch presenters, you might see a little pause in the presentation. Please stick with us. We will move through that as quickly as possible. Let's take a look at our objectives, what we hope to cover in today's session. We want to really kind of introduce the cultural orientations approach and its differentiators in the marketplace. We want to really look at the challenges of achieving strategic performance in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous global environment. You might recognize that as the description of VUCA. We are also going to present a comprehensive cultural perspective, which is key and essential for creating the opportunity for strategic performance at the organizational level. We'll review the critical mindset and skills necessary to achieve strategic performance, and then illustrate some practical applications for realizing strategic performance and an inclusive workplace, which is the ultimate goal for our work. So let's take a quick poll and see who's with us today on the session. And if you could give us an idea of what role you play in your organization, that would be great. Your talent management, organizational development, in training, business line leader, or if you choose other, go ahead and use the question box to let us know your role. Okay. Lakeisha, thanks for producing this session for us. Can you show us the results? All right, looks like we have an even split between organizational development and training professionals on the line with us today. Thanks for being with us. That's exciting to have you in this presentation. We're looking really towards a strategic performance framework in our Cultural Orientations Guide 6th edition. And we have folded in some of the forms and the models that TMC has been known for 35 years of consulting work that we have been doing with our clients. We have moved it into a new structure called the Strategic Performance Framework. And we're going to spend considerable time on this today, introducing it and making sure that you're comfortable with this new framework. But as an overview, on the left-hand on the left-hand side, you see cultural perspective being the beginning of our journey towards strategic performance. And that really is the development of cultural competence from open attitude and self-awareness, other awareness, until we realize cultural insights. And we move into the 4 key cultural skills of cultural due diligence, style switching, cultural dialogue, and cultural mentoring. And then at the end, and as a result of exercising both our cultural development as well as exercising our cultural skills, we're able to exercise influence. We're able to be more collaborative partners in our organization. We're able to be more successful in our negotiations and more effective in our communication as well. So that is a high-level overview of our new model called the Strategic Performance Framework. Let's get into a couple of the detailed points if we can. So let me pass it over to Karen. Karen, if you're speaking, I can't hear you. I think you might be on mute. And Karen, it might be your phone that is on mute because it looks like on the platform you are not muted. And I'm not sure, okay. All right, it looks like Karen's having some audio issues here too. So let me take this poll and get us moving into some of this content. So the second poll that we'd like to just kind of get a feel for who's on the line and what are some of your priorities. The question is, which of the following is a priority for enhancing your organizational strategic performance? And we have 5 different options here. One is enhancing interpersonal communication. Second is influencing across a matrix environment. Third is strengthening cross-border negotiation skills. Fourth is improving team collaboration. And the 5th is achieving merger and acquisition or JV synergies. And let's see what our audience is saying today. Good. All right, so looks like improving team collaboration seems to be our highest need, followed by influencing across a matrix environment. Excellent, thank you. And that improving team collaboration we see as a continual theme for sure. So let me see if I can get Joerg on the line and pass this over to Joerg. Joerg, are you with us?
So first I should ask whether you can hear me.
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Joerg.
There was a 4th grader than me at work here, and I expect that it was Karen as well. But Lynne, to the earlier poll results, what I think is interesting, that teaming in a matrix organization is obviously a theme that we are seeing in many organizations, right?
Absolutely.
And that just makes, culture incredibly relevant on so many different levels, in some surprising ways, I think, as well. And I think that's what the next slide is trying to tell us a little bit. What is the cultural orientations approach? And related to that, of course, is what kind of problem does it solve? And so first of all, I think it's important to recognize that what we've tried to do in the cultural orientations approach, evolve an understanding of culture into a comprehensive system that is, first of all, well academically grounded, but has a number of other features as well. And maybe we can advance the slide a little more so we can kind of talk about this. So first of all, it's a combination of an online platform, as you will know, that is hosts a suite of customizable learning solutions, because culture is no longer just about an international business environment. Culture resides in all kinds of nooks and crannies of a global matrix organization. And so we needed to evolve, various different learning solutions and performance solutions with that. Included in that is, by the way, the certification of internal practitioners in this approach, because many organizations have found that this partnership of external and internal resources is really critical. It's built upon strong foundations of cultural differences that combines an anthropologically based understanding of culture with some of the research in neuroscience and emotional intelligence, and Karen will tell us a little more about especially the connection with neuroscience, which is really helpful. So out of that came really a solution for a number of different problems, right? One is that organizations need proven, scalable solutions that are agile and can respond dynamically to needs as they evolve. So that's what we've built here. And they need to support and align with the goals of many organizations to create inclusive environments. At the same time, we also focused this very much on leadership and leading in an environment where the various different performance aspects needed to be addressed, and because the question of culture has become bigger than that. So we are really very much looking at creating an adaptable skill set within a highly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous global environment where differences matter in so many different ways. And I hope that the cultural orientations approach and the tools it comprises, puts that at the disposal, both in training, organization development, and other contexts as well. So
thank you, Joerg.
Karen is connected. That's great. You want to
yes, speaking of the VUCA world.
That's right, because you've done a lot of work with that concept, actually. So do you want to say a few words around this and how relevant it is, actually?
Yes, and what we have done with this particular model is to insert how important the COI is and the cultural orientation approach can be for understanding what we call the antidote to the VUCA world. With this kind of approach, we understand that we can create a better vision, much better understanding of ourselves and others, getting clarity on our value systems, and some of the unconscious elements that motivate us in terms of coming to alignment in negotiations and collaboration. And in addition, once we understand a lot of these more unconscious motivations, we are better able to behave in a more agile and an adaptable way. And in particular, a lot of the work that we're drawing on comes from work done at the U.S. Army War College. And in general, many of us have seen that a lot of the work in leadership is moving away from a very hierarchical and paternalistic approach. And why we have all this volatility and uncertainty, it actually doesn't allow for creativity and innovation. So with this massive paradigm shift away from centralized, hierarchical, and paternalistic leadership, we find that this kind of strategic thinking helps those in working in a very VUCA environment to become more adaptable and to think in more situationally specific and appropriate ways. in particular regarding our cultural value systems that become very connected to our emotions and basically how our brains have become acculturated over time. So we've inserted this into our work on the cultural orientation approach as the most appropriate way to think of culture as a process and how our brains continue to change our behaviors and sense of self-interest and the way we connect with others. Joerg, would you like to say a little bit about how the notion of culture has changed over time?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's well captured also on the next slide, where I think we've seen and we've tried to respond to in this approach and in the development of this approach, actually a recognition that the world is literally changing, and that our notions of culture and our understanding of differences has to evolve with that. And that's what I tried to, that I mentioned earlier a little bit, but it's really related to how we evolve this whole approach. So for example, I mean, this is just a very quick example of a VUCA phenomenon here on this page, but when you think about you know, the population growth by region and based on just a high level kind of clustering, how we between now and 2050 we are seeing a tremendous shift in global representation that our talent strategies, our organizational strategies, and so forth have to accommodate and be ready for. And it's not just a change in numbers, but it reflects also a shifting power relationship. And in 2050, for example, you don't see much Europe represented there, and considering the importance at the global level of Europe to the economy to date, and the changes that we are predicting based on rising economies, emerging economies, and so forth, you know, we're looking at a very different future. And how are we leading our organizations into that? And if we go to the next slide, to just explore a little bit of how we have evolved this approach. The words, Karen, that you mentioned earlier, it's not just about change, but it's about our adaptability and understanding that the real skills are moving away from the traditional areas of negotiating, let's say, across boundaries or borders, to a situational agility that where we may, in the course of a day, navigate an incredibly diverse cultural environment in the various different interactions that we are engaged in, while at the same time keeping a much more strategic focus and direction in mind for our organizations, within which the future is very different from what we can assume the past has been. So this, if you put this at the micro level, at the macro level of our interaction, this changes actually how we need to address the cultural challenges. And you see that in the evolution of this approach. And this is, this basically, this slide is, it's a bit dense, of course, but it really tells a little bit about that evolution. We started with internationalization, then we moved to globalization. We then entered an era of diversity and multiculturalism, where both the fields of diversity and culture met each other in organizations. And increasingly, we have focused our approach to that of strategic performance, unlocking strategic performance with an eye on adaptability and the situational management, or the navigation, if you will, of cultural complexity in our interactions, which also meant that we needed to recognize quite formally in our approach that culture is not something that happens, or a difference between countries, which is what many people oftentimes reduce the understanding of culture to, but essentially saying that culture is a phenomenon that happens at the national level, of course, it happens at individual levels increasingly because we can no longer take for granted that the backgrounds of those with which we interact is to some degree similar to ours, even though we might be living in the same place. Identity group, this is basically subgroups within a particular society. A team level, a functional level, teams build cultures, for example. Functions are recognized by different cultures, and obviously at the organization level, we can see culture as a key distinguishing feature, and that manifests in things like acquisition integrations and joint ventures and so forth. So, in fact, we have evolved our understanding and discussion of culture to those various different levels. And I think one of the strengths of the cultural orientations approach is that it can be applied almost in a surgical fashion to challenges, dilemmas, and cultural gaps at any of these levels of culture. And our work, since this is a training and largely organizational development audience, our work as from an organizational development perspective is very often to do a good diagnostic of at what level are we encountering what kind of breakdowns, and how do we then equip leaders with the requisite skills in order to close those gaps. And the skills upon which this whole approach is built are relevant at each of these levels of cultures, and we'll discuss that in a second as well.
Great, Joerg. So this actually shows us how these patterns of associations can impact our beliefs, behaviors, and assumptions. Since we have an echo, I will hand this back to you, Joerg.
Okay. Well, you must be in the Alps somewhere. I think that's what you're saying, and it was really hard to hear you for a moment there, Karen. But really, one of the ways that we look at culture is really as a process of association. And the associations are made as we are growing up in an environment reinforced and rewarded by a particular group that we interact within, by an environment that we are part of. So it's a pattern of associations between behaviors, beliefs, and our emotions. And if you think about culture as a conditioning process, as we're growing up, as we're interacting within a group, we are being quite literally conditioned to make those associations. So certain behaviors become associated with a belief, and they become associated with an emotional reaction or state. So when we shake somebody's hand, for example, in a Western culture, we learn that that's an appropriate greeting, and maybe to some degree more formal greeting, and we come to associate it with positive to neutral emotional responses. That's different for somebody else who grows up in a different context. So that's really what we mean by culture. So it's a way of looking at the conditioning that we would have received as individuals, as a member of groups. And I think this notion of conditioning applies really well and matches very well with the findings of emotional intelligence and neuroscience as well, because oftentimes we find that our neural pathways become conditioned so there is a biology to this conditioning that we can actually trace in the neural pathways of our brains, where we can actually almost see these conditioning processes now when we're scanning brains and so forth. So it's a really interesting convergence, and it's all related to this definition of culture, namely being what we expect, reinforce, and reward by and within a particular group of people. So maybe we can advance the slide. This is the reason why we spend a little more time on this is people use the word culture all the time, they oftentimes don't define it. And when they do define it, there are just so many different definitions. So in this approach to culture actually takes a very instrumental view of culture and associates culture as a conditioning process. So in a sense, when we work with different groups, when we're trying to blend and create culture together, we get groups to think about what kind of a conditioning do we need to let go of, and how do we recondition ourselves. So it's an act of consciousness creation in a sense. All of that relies on critical aspects of our strategic performance model, and that's why we've created it to guide us through this process. So it starts with a solidly cultural perspective. The definition of culture is very important, and when we work with practitioners in our certification processes, we emphasize that while there are so many different ways of looking at culture, to make this a powerful approach that creates adaptable, agile organizations and leaders and teams, it is actually really important to keep the integrity of that cultural definition intact. But that's not enough. We need to then, on the basis of that definition, generate cultural insights with the foundation of an open-mindedness that yields self-awareness first, because if I become aware of how I am conditioned as part of my cultural influences, that becomes the backdrop of actually understanding other awareness. And many approaches to both diversity and culture very often start with the other. Right? Let's portray the other and how the other is really other and different from us. And it very rarely starts with us as the starting point. And starting with us first is actually a very important piece of this approach. Lynn,
Joerg, it looks like we have, Joerg, it looks like we have Karen back on the line too. So I just want to make sure that the neuroscience construct that we have explored, that she's able to take some time to contribute to that. Karen, can we do a quick audio check with you and get you back in?
Yes, Joerg, you would say that you have become a pseudo-neuroscientist with this great explanation of what you've done here. And I think this is interesting for all of us to think of today, that many of us are not aware of the way that this kind of conditioning, as Joerg says, this kind of acculturation of our neural pathways and how deeply attached we become to certain value systems around time and around space and around just the elements of cooperation and collaboration, that because of this particular science, both in terms of culture studies and in neuroscience, we now are learning what many of the scientists say, that we can learn to use our brain to change our brains. And because things are moving so quickly, and cultural drift, many of the scientists would say, is here to stay, and things are moving so much faster, our biology, or the human brain, can't move as fast as we would like it to because of this deep unconscious acculturation and attachment to value systems. So many of us, of what a lot of us are doing in our work, is helping others. Please, we will help you to slow down your rapid cognition, to pay attention to how quickly judgments are made. And in my work, and I'm sure with all of you, you find that just using a language regarding non-judgmental approaches to understanding differences just helps slow down the thinking, the rapid cognition, the judgments, and the reactive behavior. And much of what our work is helping to be more proactive around the behaviors that will actually create working trust, because many of us are working in these very diverse, very defensive, potentially, situations. And just to slow that down and have non-judgmental thinking is so powerful, not only in the workspace, but many say in their families and with their friends and in their travels. So we find this to be extremely revolutionary in terms of helping people understand how their brains work.
it's also really hard to do, right? I mean, to bring a non-judgmental perspective to ourselves and our interactions, I think particularly when we are stressed, right? So,
especially when we're stressed, right?
Yeah, and a lot of, I think, cultural interactions happen under conditions of stress. When I think about, I mean, you mentioned the private sphere, which is a different context, but in the sphere of work, when you think about the organizations we work in, it's an extremely stressed workplace, especially under these VUCA conditions, right? So the temptation to regress is actually really high, and that's I think where the whole trick relies of evolving our brains, right?
Yes. Yes, especially under stress because of the hormones that surge and hijack our critical thinking skills. Just when we need to step to our counterpart side is exactly when we can't do it physically or biologically. Because it is true under stress, there are those biological mechanisms that will override the ability, even though your intention is to cooperate and to share, it overrides that primal need to protect ourselves and to become extremely defensive, which then basically helps I would say, even intensify stereotyping. And because we're trying to be non-judgmental and move toward generalizations, it's very difficult biologically unless we understand that kind of impact that our own cultural perspective has created on our thinking and behavior. Anything else you'd like to say about ethnocentrism and relativism?
No, I think it's I think it's really important that we understand that we are in the context, the stress levels and our context may actually push us into more of an ethnocentric mindset, right? That is based on stereotypes, although we are understanding a lot more of the science behind it, right? So, but the conditions for our work to take place may not be conducive to applying that science very well. And I think that's what we are finding in our work too, that the sophistication of our understanding has evolved tremendously, but not necessarily the skill sets that people bring to bear in organizations. So, so while it seems basic to do a lot of work on stereotyping, it becomes almost more important. And I think we can see this on so many levels that rather than becoming more inclusive, we are becoming almost more divisive. We're talking more about inclusiveness and differences and multiculturalism, but the reality becomes almost more divisive, and that may not be an accident. So very often our first step in this approach is to move people from stereotypes to stereotypical perceptions, both of others and of themselves actually, to a more differentiated view that starts with some generalizations in a non-judgmental framework. And I think doing that work is almost becoming more important rather than less important, which is what many people say.
And Joerg, just to take off on that, ethno-relativism and ethnocentrism often comes into play, we see in our client work at the headquarter level. So the headquarter centricity quite often kicks in when they're working in a global environment, and the headquarters has initiatives and has metrics that they hope to achieve for their business results. But in reality, when they deploy it across the world to all of their entities, we find that very headquarter-centric approach to a global rollout often leads to a derailment of the project or of the process that they're trying to actually deploy. And if they get to a place of more relative or more regionalized or localized approach in combination with a global approach, that we've seen as more successful in terms of the local organizations accepting and adapting to the organizational changes that are happening. And I wonder if there's some comments you wanted to say still about that, because we have a organizational development heavy population on the line today. So any other thoughts?
Yes, I'd like
Karen,
to comment on that.
Yeah.
Yes, I would. It's so interesting, Lynn. That's another element that I find is extremely important. Spending time understanding the levels of culture is so important. And just as an example, last week I was working in Saudi Arabia with a large organization, and the focus of the program was on global, on national cultural differences. But the more that we worked in finding a way that organizations can be much more adaptable and agile globally or outside of their national origin, is to understand how much conflict and divisiveness there is between HQ and the affiliates. And basically this, I find in almost every situation that I work in, is it's not looking at global or organizational culture, but it's both. It's the world of paradox that we are working in. And this is, I find that that kind of alignment, that kind of clarity and vision and agility within the organization to understand the differences between HQ and the affiliates, just that piece helps them with the global market, because then they have an identity, they have a vision that works and is clear when they go in the global space.
Absolutely.
Joerg, any comment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can only resonate with that. And this is, I mean, I guess why the approach, the cultural orientations approach is built the way it's built. Because very often first of all, our initial diagnosis of issues, challenges, breakdowns usually proves to not be quite accurate. So very often there is this notion headquarters is infringing on our local autonomy and how we do things, and that just may not be the case. And that puts really into view, are we understanding the situation? Are we analyzing the problem well? And by teaching people to apply this approach, especially around the model of culture and its various different components, and really thinking through at what level do those breakdowns occur. So we may find that the breakdown is actually because of two teams, leadership teams, and their cultures that are colliding, or at the functional level where you have those breakdowns. And when you then teach, I mean, almost walk people as a facilitator, as a consultant through a process, and that process is very much tied to those key cultural skills we are seeing right now, because as part of that process, the participants are acquiring those skills. And they're not easy skills. They may read easily on the screen here, but they're not easily developed. So, for example, cultural due diligence is the act of assessing and preparing for the impact of cultural differences and similarities. There are two tricky things here. First of all, what I mentioned earlier, and Karen, you mentioned as well, that we may attribute the wrong source to the cultural challenge we are facing. We may think it's national culture, while in fact it is functional culture, or the breakdowns are at the team level, and that's the better unit of focus to bring to this than framing it into where we started. The other piece here is the notion of similarities. Many people are quite ready to accept that a challenge comes about from a cultural difference, but cultural similarities can be as challenging and as blinding as differences, because we also know that differences, when seen through a non-judgmental lens, turn into an asset. Similarity makes the world feel better. We're dealing with people who are similar, who act in similar ways, have a similar understanding of the world, but it also blinds us from critical opportunities we may need to tap into, especially as we're needing to build more adaptive responses. So carefully evaluating and assessing similarities and differences, and not assuming similarity has less risk, is actually very important in that process. The next skill in this process we then need to guide people through is the idea of style switching. how do we need to adapt our approach, essentially, from the customary and the conventional away to an approach that is more inclusive and mindful of the other at whatever level that may be. So that's the intellectual question. The second question then is, when I understand, it may be me who needs to adapt my approach. Do I know how to do that? And am I comfortable with doing that? And very often working with individuals or teams through these two questions unlocks an enormous degree of power, actually. And that's the edge of learning, since we're talking to a training and and OD audience. That's the edge at which we need to inspire people, teams, groups, entire organizations to lean into the discomfort space, if you will. That leaning, right, that seizing of that discomfort space can only happen if we make explicit and conscious that entire process, and cultural dialogue very often is part of that, is an overt part of navigating the edge of what is comfortable. So exploring those differences and negotiating mutual adaptations, becomes a really, really important skill above and beyond style switching. Sometimes we're in simple situations where we clearly need to style switch in order to be successful. In many situations, especially those global matrix organizations where we need to team and collaborate differently, it's no longer very clear who adapts to whom and what is a realistic expectation to set. So we need to negotiate that. We need to create the cultural norms upon which we will that we feel bound to and create accountability to, because we can no longer assume that any given cultural norm should be prevailing. And just one note here, because we're adding technology to the mix of things and so forth, it's actually a really, really important skill to negotiate the cultural foundation of our interactions. The fourth skill is that of cultural mentoring. And once we have negotiated our cultural norms, we need to make sure that we are supporting one another. And that act of support is, we just call it cultural mentoring here. So when you take in these four skills, it's actually a very sophisticated skill set that that this approach helps us to develop. And again, I covered them right now at the level of difficulty. I think cultural due diligence to some level is easier than actually cultural mentoring, which may be the most sophisticated skill. Cultural due diligence, just very briefly, and this model of culture that we built around three distinct dimensions, within which we have all kinds of aspects of difference that come from, research on cultural differences and so forth, that synthesizes this, is sense of self. How people view their identity and are motivated, a very, very important, almost very core aspect of our cultural conditioning that we carry with us. The next one is thinking style, how we process information, how we make it's also related to how we make decisions, how we analyze problems, how we look at data, how we view data, how we relate to data and information. That's a very, very important part of our cognitive conditioning, if you will. And the interaction style is another very important one, namely how we then actualize, how the sense of self and how our thinking style actually shows up in how we interact and connect with others. And again, we can package the four skills around this assessment of culture, this understanding of culture. It is part of how we do our cultural due diligence. Those are elements that will impact where and how we need to style switch. In our cultural dialogue, these concepts and what within each of these dimensions, the language that sits within these dimensions, can help us in that dialogue process. And then when it comes to mentoring, the same way. I mean, it gives us information as to what we need to mentor on and who we need to mentor. So that said, I mean, I think this puts the whole strategic performance model into perspective, then that on the foundation of a solid cultural perspective that guides us through general insights on how culture works, the definition, as we said earlier, an open attitude on the basis of that, starting with ourselves before we then create awareness of others, it helps us then build skills that are, I sometimes call them meta skills. They're skills that sit behind business skills, right? They're skills that we need almost in between our mindset and our behavior that help us actualize a much more culturally, culturally competent behavior. And so those are, as we mentioned, cultural due diligence, style switching, cultural mentoring, and cultural dialogue. But then, they never occur in and of themselves. They're actualized through a whole number of behaviors that yield better, more agile, more adaptable communication, negotiations, collaboration, and certainly influence.
And I think that gets us to a really great place, Joerg, to illustrate a couple of examples in terms of the application of the cultural orientations approach as an approach to the differences that we experience every day in the workplace, and an approach that allows us to be more inclusive in our vocabulary, be more inclusive in our leadership, and generate that strategic performance that we were talking about. So I think the cross-functional collaboration, negotiating inclusive norms, and influencing in a global matrix are some of the examples that we have. I wonder, you want to take the cross-functional first, or you want me to take one of these first, Joerg?
Why don't you go ahead with an example, and then I'll share another one.
That's great. So I see, Karen, you're back with us too. Super. So we'll bring you in as well. But let me start with the middle case. We have a situation where we supported a client who needed to negotiate inclusive norms. And the reason they needed to negotiate inclusive norms is because they had a sales activity that they had been working towards, even in pre-sale, actually, not even at the actual project implementation stage. This was a multi-million-dollar pre-sale engagement. And at the engineering level, so at the functional level, they had a communication breakdown. And the communication breakdown was based on national societal, functional, as well as team-based conflicts and different ways of approaching the business initiative. And by losing that multi-million-dollar pre-sale, they had the executive order from the CEO of the company to negotiate inclusive norms as a means to ensuring success of future projects. And so they partnered with TMC to work through what that would look like. How do you build an organizational energy behind changing the vocabulary, changing the approach towards difference, and creating a more inclusive environment? And so what we did with them is, in order to make sure that at the organizational level this initiative could gain traction, is we embedded COA certified champions inside the organization across the globe. This was not a cadre of headquarter-based champions who then went out and trained and then came back to headquarters. This was an initiative that partnered at the local level with a global framework. And at the local level, the presentation, the concepts, and the constructs were translated for the local environment, both for the cultural environment that they were working in, as well as the functional and organizational culture that was different than the headquarter culture and frameworks that the headquarters was working from. And so with that, certification of practitioners globally, they were able to, on a local level, create a common language and a non-judgmental vocabulary around difference that was both locally implemented and globally coordinated, so that the common language was at the global level, but how that common language was introduced, rewarded, and reinforced was not only at the global level, it was also embedded at the local level too. And by doing that, they shifted regional cultural preferences to global cultural thinking. So thinking about differences from a perspective of neutral vocabulary to describe rather than to judge based on the approach one is taking. As a result, they saw decreased cultural mishaps happening across the globe, across teams, across functions, and an increased positive team and organizational rapport. And they measured that through customer satisfaction and employee satisfaction surveys, 360 evaluations at the managerial level, and then, of course, the facilitators who were at the global level, the COA certified facilitators, gave that feedback as well. We also tracked success through enhanced style switching abilities and a higher level of EQ coming into emotional intelligence and empathetic listening coming into the dynamics between manager and subordinate, between leader and team, between team cohorts, and that led to an increased amount of cultural dialogue that was happening. And so at the very local level, they saw the change then build into something that at the global level created an inclusive workplace with an increased bid-win rate. And so they didn't experience that multi-million-dollar failure anymore. They were actually able to see an increased win rate in their pre-sales and then actually in the implementation of those sales. So that's our first example.
That's a great example. Yeah, that's a great example. And in fact, you probably find that in those situations, and this is obviously one of many examples around these notions, that yes, you're gaining some important results, right? The increased bid win rate. Yep. But you're also shifting other things in the culture. You're actually improving other things in the culture as well. So I'll just add a quick example, and I'll make it very quick because I recognize that there may be some questions by the participants as well. I'd love to talk a little bit about the influencing in a global matrix environment real quickly because this was an organization that was very obviously globalizing, and what does that mean? Usually it translates into a kind of a one company philosophy now across across borders and across business units. And as a result, you take an already complex organizational matrix, now global, so you add various layers onto that. And it just created a really confusing and disorienting context for behavior. So while structurally, and that's what leaders do, right? Or executives do. Essentially, you create a container for behavior of others through structural rearrangements. But if those structural rearrangements, they look good on paper, they make sense theoretically, but the context for daily behavior becomes actually really confusing, and that's what tactically and tangibly that organization was suffering from. And just because we did away, or the organization did away with certain impediments, structural impediments, didn't mean that the behavior also then followed suit. So people still communicated largely with who they were comfortable with, who they knew from before, where it was easy, you know, not necessarily where they needed to go, but they went where it was easy to go for information or for validation. They forgot others in the mix that they are now connected to, had a right to connect to, but essentially didn't feel comfortable with for many different reasons. So a very critical piece was there to create a development process for people to guide them through understanding their new network context. And so the bullet point here says assess their social networks and critical relationships. That became part of actually bringing into awareness, who am I connected to? Does this work? Does this network that I'm looking at, how does that match the strategy and the desired connections that I need to make? And what are the gaps that I have within it? Partially because I don't have anybody in my social network here in the company, and I need to reach out and connect and build relationships with other individuals, or I may be connected to a critical individual in my network, but I feel information is not flowing readily. I don't have the level of trust and relationship that helps me do that. And then really from there, using that analysis as a starting point for this cultural due diligence, and then it's developing and helping people to create strategies for style switching and coaching and all the skills that we mentioned before, and then almost embed that, formalize that as part of a peer coaching process. So that was a highly effective strategy for that organization. But I'm wondering if we should take the few next minutes for some questions or feedback or so.
Yeah, Joerg, I was just going to do a quick wrap-up of our presentation here, just to remind everybody of the kinds of things that we talked about, and then we'll get to the questions. So really, culture is more than a nationality or an identity group. We contend that it's a phenomenon that occurs whenever we form or interact with groups, and it really does underpin our performance, and it's what we do about those differences and similarities that indicates and that advances our performance results. So really, culture enables responsiveness to the forces of VUCA and competitive advantage. Leaders, teams, organizations need to elevate their cultural competence to achieve strategic performance results based on our framework process. And really, the cultural orientations approach, which is our certification process, offers really a comprehensive system and academically grounded methodology to develop the mind and skill sets of cultural competent leaders, and institutionalizes adaptive management and agility with business practices that are calibrated to a multicultural environment. Reflect back on those headquarter and subsidiary discussions we had earlier. And this approach really combines the Cultural Navigator, the online platform, and a suite of customizable learning solutions with the certification. So really is a comprehensive approach. And I want to take an opportunity to thank our panelists and stop the recording, and then we'll be able to take our questions here real quick. We also have a next series. Go to tncorp.com, our